Bueno, entonces buenas tardes a todos. Eh, Muchas gracias por estar aquí presente. Ángela, porfa, tú puedes cerrar ahí. Va a ser un poquito como incómodo para algunos, por lo que tenemos la traducción aquí simultánea. Y para los que están conectados virtualmente, pues muchísimas gracias. El día de hoy, el equipo de Responsabilidad Integral Colombia tiene para ustedes un invitado especial y una presentación muy interesante en métricas en seguridad de procesos, cómo medir esa efectividad de un programa de seguridad. Aquí en el salón en este momento nos acompaña un ícono de la ingeniería química, el profesor Marcelo, que está presente con nosotros. Están también representantes y amigos del Ministerio de Trabajo, del Ministerio de Ambiente, están compañeros de empresas afiliadas, Hasman, Clarian, también se encuentran las chicas de Acoplásticos, nuestra entidad coordinadora. Y digamos, tenemos nuestros dos invitados, Sherry y Dani, de American Chemistry Council, y también está la Unidad Nacional, perdón Jesús, que también está presente. No sé quién más nos faltó. Ay, acaba de llegar Daniela también de Andy, entonces bienvenida. El día de hoy, entonces, vamos a pedirles el favor de cumplir estas siguientes reglas para los que están conectados de manera virtual y preguntas en el chat. Se contará con un espacio al final para poder responderlas y asimismo vamos a diligenciar un formulario de participación que lo vamos a postear en un momento en el chat para presentarlo. Lo que compartiremos con ustedes el día de hoy es seguridad de procesos. Espérate, envíamelo y yo lo coloco desde el celular. Compartiremos el día de hoy seguridad de procesos, pues digamos una regulación, cómo está el update de la regulación en Colombia, y después Dani nos va a presentar los cambios a través de la API RP 754 y cómo lo responsible care a nivel global impulsa el desempeño de la seguridad de procesos en la industria. Y al final tendremos preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, pues muchas gracias a los invitados presenciales y virtuales. Vamos a aprender muchísimo el día de hoy y pues bienvenidos. Entonces, como saben, pues nosotros somos Responsabilidad Integral Colombia, o se conoce también como Responsible Care, que es una iniciativa internacional que afilia empresas del sector químico y la cadena de suministro para fortalecer la gestión segura de los productos químicos. 94, o sea, cumplimos 30 el próximo año. Digamos que esta es la premisa con la que trabajamos aquí el equipo, de que nos gusta mucho, que ir juntos es comenzar, mantenerse juntos es progresar, pero trabajar juntos es triunfar, y es realmente lo que hacemos desde Responsabilidad Integral Colombia, cómo podemos vincular desde las competencias de cada uno un trabajo dinámico para poder lograr los objetivos, en este caso pues de seguridad de procesos. Responsible Care, que siempre hacemos el overview en estos escenarios, es una iniciativa voluntaria de la industria química que impulsa esa mejora continua en gestión segura de productos químicos y permite lograr excelencia en el desempeño en 3 esferas: ambiental, seguridad de procesos y todo el tema de seguridad y salud en el trabajo. Se originó en Canadá en el año 1985 y se adoptó en Colombia. Como vimos ahora, vamos a cumplir 30 el próximo, entonces desde el año 94. Hacemos ese. Después con las memorias les compartimos un video, digamos que tenemos sobre la iniciativa, pero básicamente, digamos, mencionamos que la iniciativa fue creada en Colombia por iniciativa de 3 entidades que los llamamos los padres de responsabilidad integral, nuestros papás. En este momento hay 2 padres presentes, la Andy y Acoplásticos en la casa donde estamos, y también un tercer actor que es el Consejo Colombiano de Seguridad. Agradecemos a nuestros afiliados por ser parte de la iniciativa. Aquí en Colombia contamos con empresas afiliadas que pertenecen al sector productivo y comercializador de productos químicos, y asimismo con empresas transportadoras y operadores logísticos. Nosotros en responsabilidad integral trabajamos por brindar un valor agregado a nuestros afiliados en temas relacionados con seguridad de procesos que a día de hoy, transporte y almacenamiento de mercancías peligrosas, riesgo químico, preparación y respuesta a emergencias y almacenamiento de mercancías peligrosas. Aquí es importante que nos ayuden a subir el número de nuestros followers, y esta es la manera como pueden encontrarnos en nuestras redes, donde tratamos de estar al día en información que es relevante para los temas que tratamos. Entonces los esperamos para los que están conectados virtualmente y los que están presentes y no nos siguen, pues a unirse. Usted, profe, tiene redes, ¿cierto? Ah, bueno. Bueno, entonces acá el profe Marcelo nos dice que, le digo yo, si tiene redes, me dice que no usa celular, entonces, pero está bien dateado, dice. Entonces, vamos a empezar con el primer punto, seguridad de procesos, la regulación en Colombia. Entonces, digamos que aquí, pues, en representación de RI, pues, estoy como el día de hoy. Aquí simplemente que lo hemos dado en diversas ocasiones de manera, Susana, con la que trabajamos en unos puntos, que es la historia de accidentes y su impacto en el desempeño en seguridad de procesos, pero hay un accidente que marca un... Ok. Bueno, qué pena que había un problema de internet aquí en Acoplásticos. Estamos. Entonces, digamos que parte del tema de seguridad de procesos que es importante mencionarlo aquí en el país es esa diferencia entre el marco de seguridad física, seguridad industrial y seguridad de procesos, sobre todo en los temas relacionados entre seguridad de procesos y seguridad industrial, que hay una línea y un espacio de tiempo que, digamos, se cruzan muy comunes. ¿Qué se define como seguridad de procesos? Seguridad de procesos es el área de la ingeniería que busca eliminar, prevenir, controlar y mitigar los incidentes que se presentan en instalaciones fijas o sistemas permanentes en los que se pueden presentar liberaciones de sustancias peligrosas puras o en mezcla con el aire. Bueno, continuamos, esperemos en nombre del Padre. Bueno, entonces estábamos sobre la definición de seguridad de procesos, y hay un tema que es la pérdida de contención de un material peligroso o energía que pueden acarrear estos eventos de seguridad de procesos, como incendios, explosiones, dispersiones tóxicas. Pero aquí, digamos, en Colombia, la normativa nos ha llevado a trabajar en una diferenciación entre seguridad de procesos y seguridad industrial. Colombia, sobre todo, ha sido muy fuerte en la normativa asociada a seguridad industrial o personal, que tiene que ver con la situación de seguridad en lugares de trabajo, y seguridad de procesos, que normativamente es un tema que se puso, digamos, en la agenda de las entidades regulatorias en el año 2016 acá en Colombia. Vemos que principalmente el objeto de análisis de la seguridad industrial o personal es seguridad de la persona o trabajador, mientras que la seguridad de procesos está enfocado en los sistemas TED, y nos vemos a la seguridad industrial o personal son eventos de seguridad personal, mientras que seguridad de procesos, eventos catastróficos. Y digamos que el tema que vamos a tratar hoy, que tiene que ver con los indicadores de DCE, a tasas de fatalidad, días perdidos, entrenamientos, tiempo entre reentrenamientos, número de observaciones, por ejemplo, mientras que En seguridad de proceso contamos con indicadores también reactivos y activos, pero que están ligados a pérdida de contingencia, frecuencia de inspecciones, acciones, desviaciones en variables de proceso. Entonces, digamos que es importante para mencionar que ahorita lo que estamos trabajando es todo el tema de seguridad de procesos que tiene que ver ligado con esas estrategias relacionadas con esas riesgo accidental, digamos, derivado, digamos, de esas riesgos de tipo explosiones, incendios, dispersiones tóxicas, derrames que están en relación con esa liberación de sustancias peligrosas. Entonces, aquí en Colombia, ¿qué es lo que nos motiva, digamos, parte de este invitado internacional que tenemos? Como saben, del proceso de adhesión de Colombia a la OCDE, nosotros, digamos, como país debíamos enfocarnos en 5 planes de acción para dar respuesta a todos los requerimientos del Comité Químico de la OCDE. Y como vemos aquí en esta diapositiva, pues tenemos el tema de programa de sustancias químicas de uso industrial, tenemos el tema de la adopción del sistema globalmente armonizado de clasificación y etiquetado de productos químicos, también otros temas relacionados con la eliminación de plomo en materiales didácticos de uso infantil y pinturas, implementación de un registro ambiental de emisiones y transferencia de contaminantes, pero uno de los temas también fue la implementación en el país de un programa de prevención de accidentes mayores que pues era requerido en el país. Entonces, ¿qué ha pasado en este marco regulatorio a partir de esos 5 lineamientos o 5 planes de acción? Como vemos aquí enmarcado en rojo, digamos, aunque este proceso de adhesión del país a la OCDE data desde el año 2018 y cerró, perdón, de 2013 y de 2020, cuando Colombia fue aprobada como país miembro, pero la línea normativa viene y continúa, ¿no? Pero lo que está ligado con el tema de, digamos, establecen esas regulaciones de seguridad de procesos, viene el año 2018 con la expedición del decreto 1496 que adopta el sistema globalmente armonizado, que es uno de los sistemas que también es importante en esa clasificación, autoclasificación de las instalaciones para ser cumplidoras de este programa de seguridad de procesos, y está el decreto 1347 que finalmente adopta el programa de prevención de accidentes mayor país en el año 2021, y también hay una resolución, la 0559 de 2022, establece esos valores nacionales de riesgo máximo individual accidental y que permitirán hacer esas valoraciones de riesgo para establecer si el riesgo de una instalación clasificada es aceptable o no. Entonces, la normatividad en seguridad de procesos. Aquí en esta gráfica, pues vemos todas estas normativas internacionales que fueron surgiendo en una línea de tiempo a medida que se iban presentando estos accidentes catastróficos o graves o accidentes mayores y que permitieron, digamos, definir ese rumbo de mejoramiento en los procesos para medidas de prevención en relación a estos accidentes catastróficos. Entonces tenemos los lineamientos de EPA, de OSHA, está también digamos, la normativa del Reino Unido, COMA, está también de una u otra manera, pues, digamos, lo que está aquí en verde, que ha marcado una pauta para nuestro país, que normativas. Entonces, para estructurar ese decreto 1497, como estamos trabajando en el proceso de adhesión de Colombia, Colombia debería en más normativa para dar respuesta a esos 3, que es el 19, 239 y 240, son recomendaciones en el marco de prevención para hacer respuesta a accidentes que involucran sustancias químicas, que tienen que ver con el intercambio de información concerniente a este tipo de accidentes cuando pueden causar, ¿por qué no?, daños tras instalaciones, y para entregar información al público y asegurar su participación precisamente en la toma de decisiones dentro de los procesos de prevención y respuesta a accidentes que involucran sustancias químicas. Entonces, de acuerdo con él, digamos, se empezaron a evaluar modelos de gestión en este marco conceptual que desarrolló el país para poder establecer este decreto 1347 y pues se revisaron el marco de OSHA, del Reino Unido, también los lineamientos de CCPS y toda la estrategia de la ISO 31000-2018 de ese modelo de gestión de riesgo. Pero digamos se remarcó aquí en azul porque digamos que el modelo conceptual del país giró en torno a la normativa CBESO, el lineamiento 3, que era la que estaba en ese momento en vigencia. Entonces de ahí nace el decreto 1347 de 2021, que consta de 6 artículos, 11 temas que requieren regulación. Tiene los elementos que constituyen el programa de prevención de accidentes mayor, que son 12 elementos, y un anexo muy importante, que es el anexo 3, en sus partes 1 y 2, que dan los lineamientos para que una instalación revise eso si es una instalación clasificada o no. El objetivo de este programa, así brevemente, es adoptar es adoptar el programa de prevención de accidentes mayores en Colombia para incrementar esos niveles de seguridad de las instalaciones que se clasifican en el programa y al final el alcance de proteger a los trabajadores, la población, el ambiente y la infraestructura mediante esa gestión del riesgo accidental. El ámbito de aplicación es para todas aquellas instalaciones clasificadas, sean existentes o nuevas, de acuerdo pues con lo que define el decreto para establecer cuál es nueva y cuál es existente. Hay una definición muy importante que es la de accidentes mayor, que esa viene también del convenio 164 de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, que fue adoptada en Colombia a través de la ley 320 de 1996 y que establece que un accidente mayor es todo acontecimiento repentino como emisión, incendio o una explosión de gran magnitud en el curso de una actividad en una instalación clasificada y que trascienda su perímetro. Y como veíamos ahora, en el que están implicadas una o varias sustancias químicas peligrosas y que exponga a los trabajadores, a la población, a los bienes o a la infraestructura o al ambiente, a un peligro grave, inmediato, diferido. Entonces, pues ahí mismo la definición establece que un accidente mayor puede constituir un escenario de desastre siempre y cuando cumpla con la generación de una afectación intensa, grave y extendida sobre las condiciones normales de funcionamiento de la sociedad. Asimismo establece como es sobre instalaciones clasificadas, da la definición de una instalación clasificada y dice que una instalación es considerada como clasificada cuando la presencia de sustancias químicas supera unas cantidades en unas, digamos, umbrales establecidos en el anexo 3 de ese decreto, denomina listado de sustancias químicas asociadas a accidentes mayores, o que al aplicar la famosa regla de la suma de ese listado se obtenga un valor igual o mayor a 1. Entonces, como vemos aquí, este sería, digamos, un diagrama básico que resume el decreto. Entonces, yo una instalación que utiliza sustancias químicas peligrosas, yo hago mi proceso de autoclasificación y si quedo clasificada, pues debería entonces empezar, como lo vemos aquí, un proceso de registro, una cuantificación o valoración del riesgo para saber si mi riesgo es aceptable o no, y también establecer, digamos, unos lineamientos que sí o sí debe trabajar la instalación clasifica, que es el famoso informe de seguridad, el sistema de gestión de seguridad y, digamos, trabajar también en paralelo con un plan de respuesta a emergencia. Y si un accidente mayor sucede, pues también deberá un reporte de investigación de accidentes y una revisión y mejora continua. Todo esto pues va ligado a esos lineamientos en sus procesos de inspección, vigilancia y control. Como lo vemos aquí, estos son los 12 elementos que compone el programa de prevención de accidentes mayores, de acuerdo al artículo 224, 12.6 de este decreto 1347. Entonces, pues simplemente nombrarlos, hay un listado con unas condiciones específicas. Si la instalación queda clasificada, entonces viene el registro, también debe tener un sistema de gestión de seguridad, un plan de emergencias y contingencias, debe entregar paulatinamente cuando eso se reglamente un informe de seguridad, como veamos ahora, si hay accidentes, un reporte de accidentes, una investigación de accidentes, tiene un marco de inspección, vigilancia y control, y tiene otros lineamientos que son transversales, como información disponible al público. Si está en el marco de frontera, pues un intercambio de información si hay un impacto transfronterizo, y temas que sirven también para esa planeación territorial, como la información ordenamiento territorial, el elemento 12, y el 11, la información con fines de gestión de riesgo, con información con fines de gestión territorial del riesgo. Ahora, ¿qué sigue en la reglamentación de este programa de prevención de accidentes? Porque esto es solo el inicio, el decreto. Entonces vemos que pues se tiene que reglamentar cómo va a ser el registro, cómo debe ser ese sistema de gestión de seguridad que debe integrarse al sistema de gestión de seguridad y salud en el trabajo, cómo van a ser esos lineamientos para que el plan de emergencias y contingencia incluya estos escenarios de riesgo accidental, también cuáles van a ser los lineamientos para la construcción del informe de seguridad, cómo debe ser ese registro y reporte de incidentes y accidentes mayores, la investigación de incidentes y accidentes mayores, todos los temas de inspección, vigilancia y control, cómo serán, y también los otros lineamientos que son información disponible al público, el intercambio de información relacionada con accidentes mayores que pueden causar el impacto transfronterizo, y todos los información con fines de gestión territorial del riesgo e información con fines de ordenamiento territorial. Y algo que nos preguntan mucho es por dónde comenzar. Entonces, el primer tema sería la identificación, un proceso de identificación si soy o no una instalación clasificada. Para esto, digamos que está el tema de autoclasificación de las instalaciones. Entonces yo soy la instalación Ocampo Gómez Químicos S.A., entonces debo primero establecer si estoy autoclasificada o no, y para esto trabajo con el anexo 3 de ese decreto, que tiene dos partes. Entonces la parte 1 es basado en categorías del SGA, que asocia peligros físicos para la salud y para el ambiente, y la parte 2, sustancias químicas puras, que es con base en la normativa CBSO 3, que fue pues la que está todavía en vigencia y que estaba en ese momento cuando se describió el marco conceptual y se expidió el decreto. Entonces, como vemos aquí, por ejemplo, en la parte 1, que es con base en esa lista de peligros asociados con peligros de sistema globalmente, esta edición es la que adoptó Colombia. Entonces aquí vemos, por ejemplo, peligros para la salud, está, por ejemplo, toxicidad aguda, categoría 1, todas las vías de exposición. Entonces aparece un umbral, que en este caso, como nos basamos en CBSO, estos son los umbrales superiores, digamos, no tomamos los dos umbrales de CBSO, sino los superiores. Entonces, en este caso, para esta, por ejemplo, si yo tengo una sustancia que tiene esa clasificación y supera las 20 toneladas, entonces estaría clasificada. Lo mismo en la parte 2, es con base en un listado de sustancias específicas identificadas con nombre y número CAS. Entonces, suponiendo que tengo cloro, entonces si tengo más de 20 toneladas, entonces estaría clasificada. Pero también me dicen que debo revisar la regla de la suma. Entonces, si contamos con alguna sustancia en la parte 2 o en una categoría de peligro de la parte 1 que supera el umbral, sí, pues ya de una estoy clasificado como lo vimos ahora. Pero si es no, entonces debo aplicar la regla de la suma. Entonces, la regla de la suma de cantidad presente sobre el umbral relacionado para esa categoría de peligro, y si eso me da mayor a 1, pues entonces sí estaría clasificado, y si no, pues puedo dormir tranquilo porque no estaría clasificado. Pero entonces tengo que hacer el proceso de autoclasificación teniendo los dos listados, 1 o 2 del anexo, la regla de la suma. Ese sería el primer punto. Ahora, ¿qué más puedo hacer? Digamos que la mayoría de empresas que nos han consultado están también fortaleciendo sus sistemas de gestión de seguridad de procesos. Entonces, como vimos ahí, pues es muy importante tener en cuenta que los escenarios accidentales se pueden presentar y que esos elementos principales serían pues un elemento iniciador, un evento peligroso, pérdidas de contención, y el evento final que pues puede derivar en un incendio, explosión, derrame, dispersión tóxica. Entonces, aquí simplemente vemos el famoso esquema de las barreras o capas de protección que pueden, digamos, establecer cómo puedo fortalecer mi operación para, digamos, evitar esas consecuencias de eventos finales catastróficos, de estos accidentes. Entonces, pues ahí es, digamos, cómo puedo instalar y trabajar en esas capas de protección, venir con y reducir y mitigar esos eventos iniciadores peligrosos que pueden llevar a la ocurrencia de accidentes mayores. Entonces, ahí están trabajando, que sería simplemente esas barreras que se establecen a través de esos sistemas de gestión de seguridad de procesos que permiten planear, ejecutar, revisar y mejora continua, pues a través de identificación de peligros, valoración de los riesgos y tratamiento de los riesgos precisamente a través de la instalación de barreras físicas, por ejemplo, activas, pasivas, administrativas. Entonces, digamos que cuando se gestó este tema de la regulación, se miraron los sistemas de gestión, como lo dijimos al principio. Simplemente podemos desde esa óptica, los sistemas de gestión lo que establecen es digamos, las líneas de compromiso, esas políticas, compromiso con los, entender los peligros y riesgos, cómo gestionarlos y cómo aprender de la experiencia. Entonces, aquí vemos que el decreto 1347 de 2021, como lo vemos en el lado derecho de esta diapositiva, pues tiene 16 elementos que lo de tener un sistema de gestión de seguridad, pero no inventado por el país. Si vemos aquí en las columnas de la izquierda y de la mitad, se compararon con los elementos de CCPS, los 20 elementos y los de OSHA, que son 14 elementos, y si vemos, pues Colombia, digamos, cumple dentro de esa línea en su normativa. Precisamente uno de los elementos de ese sistema de gestión de seguridad de procesos es, digamos, trabajado otra iniciativa a nivel global y en Colombia lo venimos trabajando el equipo desde hace 2 años, que es esa medición de esas métricas de desempeño de seguridad de procesos, que es realmente lo que vamos a ver el día de hoy. Pero antesito queremos contarles que precisamente para realizar ese diagnóstico del estado del arte, del sistema de gestión de seguridad de procesos de una instalación, Responsabilidad Integral Colombia ha venido trabajando de la mano con Clara Inés Arbeláez en el perfeccionamiento de una herramienta que es el primer paso en esa estructuración del modelo de gestión de seguridad de procesos que permite identificar esas brechas del estado actual y las oportunidades de mejora con base en los 20 elementos de CCPS y los 16 elementos del programa de prevención de accidentes mayores que ha sido reglamentado en Colombia. Entonces, esto es una línea base para mejora continua de las instalaciones. Y adicional, si quieres pasamos esa rapidito, en relación con esas métricas de desempeño que va a presentar ahora, pues queremos informarles antes de que precisamente pues vamos a trabajar 2 elementos de ese sistema de gestión de seguridad de procesos en 2 cursos que tenemos ahorita en el mes de agosto. Uno de ellos es la revisión de seguridad prearranque. Y el otro tema, digamos, es una de las metodologías de análisis de riesgo What If, que nos la, digamos, solicitan mucho las empresas afiliadas. Entonces, sin dar más preámbulo, digamos, vamos a dejar de compartir pantalla para que nuestro invitado la comparta, que es Dani Forest. Él nos está acompañando el día de hoy, llegó ayer desde Houston a Bogotá y va a estar toda esta semana con nosotros, director de análisis de datos de Responsible Care en la American Chemistry Council, y le damos la bienvenida a Dani, quien muy gustosamente nos va a contar hoy todo este mundo de las métricas de desempeño en seguridad de procesos. Gracias.
Good. Great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be able to talk about process safety. Today, I want to focus really on process safety performance metrics, specifically through API RP 754. This recommended practice comes from the American Petroleum Institute. I understand that many of you in Latin America use this recommended practice to collect process safety metrics. And if there's one thing that I hope you can get from this presentation, it's a better understanding of how important this metric is and how powerful it can be. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about what it is, and then how the American Chemistry Council uses it to benefit our members domestically and internationally. So like Anna said, my name is Danny Forrest. I'm the Director of Data Analytics for Responsible Care. My primary responsibilities are more so aligned with process safety. I run most of the process safety programs, as well as occupational safety, and wear a lot of hats within the organization and within Responsible Care. I'll go through the agenda and I'll express why process safety matters, and then I'll loop it into an introduction of why I'm here, how we benefit each other, and then I will bring it to what the American Chemistry Council is as an introduction. Then we're going to talk a little bit about risk-based process safety 101, just to make sure that we're all aligned. And then we'll get into the recommended practice, the actual performance indicator, and then how to classify incidents under that metric. And then we'll talk about what ACC, the American Chemistry Council, is doing with that metric. So starting with why process safety matters. Anna did a really good job of walking through a timeline of major incidents. And that's one thing that we always look to do, is learn from history. So most of you are familiar with the Bhopal, India incident. Anna just presented on it. This was an incident where it had massive impact, and it changed the thought process on process safety dramatically, along with several other incidents. Over 3,800 fatalities, 20,000 medical treatment. It was such a significant impact to all of what we see as process safety. And it really helped change the regulatory climate within the United States, but also globally. I'll say this map is not intended to be comprehensive, but really just demonstrate how some of these major events have affected change within regulation, and it continues to do so. So when we talk about why process safety matters, of course, process safety events, they'll drive regulation, they'll drive incidents, but we go beyond that. We care about our communities that we work and live in. We care about our employees. And that's really why it matters. We care about the people that serve our industry, the entire value chain of which. So how did we get here? My colleague Sherry and I have come to this beautiful country, Colombia, to talk about process safety and talk about, even beyond process safety. And that really stems back to the global initiative of what we have within our International Council of Chemical Associations. This was established in 1989. It was built off the need for global advocacy. Since 2010, ICCA has been located in Brussels. And the objective is to advocate for the industry, for all of our needs, and be seen on a global stage within organizations like the United Nations. So much like trade associations that are here within this country, that are here within Latin America, ICCA acts as that liaison between industry and and the government and government organizations like the United Nations, like the UN Environmental Program, World Trade Organizations, and more. Within ICCA, we have the Responsible Care Leadership Group, RCLG. This is the global group that manages responsible care. Oh. Apologies for that. So the RCLG manages global responsible care. They have dedicated significant resources to building capacity worldwide and affecting economies, almost 70 economies across the globe. And the big that I have highlighted here is measuring performance, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Everything that we do, we want to do it with data as an underlying understanding. That way, we're not taking shots in the dark. We understand where we are, so we know where we're going. So this is just a visual representation of where responsible care is within our globe. You can see it consumes most of Latin America, Southeast Asia. We have a big initiative on Africa right now, trying to build capacity there. But you can see it's in almost 70 different countries, something that we're very proud of within the RCLG and ICCA, and we are going to continue to push and help other countries develop responsible care programs. One of the programs that the RCLG is working on is enhancing transparency within the metrics building. And we've identified a few challenges with that. First of all, current reporting excludes blinded company identifiers, and this really limits the ability to establish trends and meaningful trends. The second one is in many countries, we lack electronic reporting capabilities. So you can imagine it can become very cumbersome whenever we're collecting raw data on spreadsheets or even in some cases PDFs. And so one thing we're trying to do is enhance collection methods through electronic capabilities. And then third, not all trade associations require companies to submit metrics. This could be for many different reasons, but helping organizations, helping local economies understand the need and importance for metrics is one thing that we're trying to do to help shift cultures, really understand the importance and the impact that the metrics can have. So taking that in responsible care and now shifting it to the United States to give the perspective of where I work, I want to introduce the American Chemistry Council. So we're a national trade association, the oldest of its kind in the United States and the largest of its kind in the United States. Our mission is to advocate for the people, policy, and products of chemistry that collectively make up the United States as a global leader within the chemical manufacturing industry. In really three different buckets. First is advocacy. We have issues like chemical management, rail and transportation, process, tax. When we talk about advocacy and we talk about going to Capitol Hill and talking to the legislatures, we do that from a data-backed source. So it's another reason why the process safety metrics and metrics in general is so important, is to inform the lawmakers and to inform the regulators on the process that we're making, how we're making it, and really enhance our message in the story that we have to tell. The second bucket that provides value to our membership from the American Chemistry Council is we engage with our members, whether that's CEO to CEO or site manager to site manager. We have opportunities for peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like on a process safety side, and understanding that safety in of itself is not proprietary. We want to be able to collectively learn from each other. So we put on workshops, on forums. We have over 20 professional conferences. And then the last bucket is our larger initiatives, our programs. Of course, responsible care sits within this bucket. We have ChemTrek. We're talking about ChemTrek earlier at lunch today. This is our emergency services organization where our members, if they have a leak, if they have a spill, if there's an incident on the highway, they can call this number and get real life up-to-date information on the hazards of the hazards of the chemical being spilled, and we can take proper steps towards mitigating the incident as soon as possible. That's just on the surface of ChemTrek. There's so much more there, but we also have economics and statistical reporting, and a lot more. We do daily smart briefs to our members, try to provide as much value as possible. So this is a snapshot. I say a snapshot. I think there's 25 logos here, and we represent, I think it's over 160 companies. Of those 160 companies, about 145 of them report metrics. It is a mandatory thing to report metrics. But you'll see that within your trade associations, within your country, you'll see a lot of these names. They come up, they're multinationals, and we all have the same interests in mind. So getting now more granular into what the United States Responsible Care Program is. Of course, I think responsible care is ingrained largely in Latin America, so it really needs no introduction. But within the United States, we have a few mandatory things. If you're an American Chemistry Council member, you have to practice responsible care. You have to report metrics, and we'll talk about that in a second. But over here on the right-hand side, you'll see some of these testaments to responsible care as it has improved performance within safety, within process safety. So, for example, responsible care companies, they have worker safety rates that are 5 times better than the United States manufacturing sector. Huge testament to how safe our member companies are. We've decreased distribution by 70% since 1995. A lot of this has to do with, of course, the company and the culture of constantly trying to improve. Also, responsible care helping drive that culture. So within the United States, at the American Chemistry Council, if you're our member, you have to practice responsible care. So what does that mean? First, we have guiding principles. Every single CEO has to sign our guiding principles that says, ultimately, there's a foundation of safety within your company. We have the responsible care management system. Within our management system, you have to take key components of that and implement it into your company's safety management system. And then we have third-party verification. So we have third-party auditors that go onto your sites, into your companies, and they audit headquarters, they audit facilities on how you've implemented the responsible care management system into your company's safety management system. And then we have areas of emphasis. We call them codes, and these codes help inform members on certain specific areas: security, process safety, product safety. The codes are, they're also components to the codes built into the responsible care management system. So a lot of it's tied together, and it's all meant to help drive improvement. And then last but not least is performance reporting. Actually, there's one other before that. Reporting. I think the most important one, though, is performance reporting, since it keeps me employed. So, you know, and today's webinar is primarily about performance reporting. I say that because I think it informs everything else, right? It informs whether we need updates. It informs whether we need to enhance programs, so on and so forth. And then the last part of US responsible care is a governance process. So if you don't abide by the rules, then you get dismissed from the program. And while we don't like to be disciplinarians, we hold our members to a high level of integrity and of expectations for safety. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions for you guys in the room or on the webinar. Okay. Great. So getting into process safety 101, and risk-based process safety. I want to start with a few definitions, just so we're all on the same page. I know many of you on the line have ample process safety experience. I've pulled these definitions from the American Petroleum Institute's recommended practice 754. And I'll use these definitions throughout the remainder of this presentation, just to make sure that we're all aligned. Is a safety event. In a lot of these words, they have very definitive meanings. So a process safety event is an unplanned or uncontrolled release of any material from primary containment, including non-toxic and non-flammable materials. So for example, this could be steam, this could be water, this could be nitrogen, it could be something very toxic, any material. It has to be from a process or an undesired event or condition that under slightly different circumstances could have resulted in a release of material. So the next definition that I'm going to show you is loss of primary containment. And I'm prefacing it because the definition is going to look very similar to a process safety event. And the reason that is because the last part of this process safety event definition allows for what Anna was talking about, tier 3s and tier 4 process safety events, severe incidents, the near misses, if you will. A loss of primary containment. So we're going to start with any unplanned or uncontrolled release of any material from primary containment, including non-toxic and non-flammable materials. Loss of primary containment results in acute spill, injury or fatality, or a fire or explosion, or an economic loss, or a community impact, or more than one of these consequences. A process, this is a long definition. A process is anything that's within production, distribution, storage, utilities, or a pilot plant facility used in the manufacturing of chemicals, petrochemicals, petroleum refining products. And it can include process equipment like reactors, vessels, piping, furnaces, and the list goes on. It's really comprehensive, and the definition is very specific. So unplanned or uncontrolled, we've already seen it twice. So unplanned or uncontrolled is related to the intent of the release. A safe plan is something that's planned, a planned release without injury, or fire damage that does not meet the definition of LOPC and therefore is not a process safety event. It's very important to understand, because if it's planned, you understood what was going to happen, and it's a release, it does not necessarily mean that it's going to be a process safety event. And then primary containment, a tank, vessel, pipe, trail car, so on and so forth. We've kind of got boring stuff, the definitions. I want to revisit again, why is this important? And we'll take another lesson from history, and I think you covered this in the presentation already. But again, another very high profile incident from 1974 in the United Kingdom, where 28 people died, 36 were injured, $100 million US dollars of damage. This was a very another very impactful incident as far as driving regulation, driving our initiatives within the United States to help drive performance within responsible care. So now that we've gotten through the definitions, we'll talk a little bit about the recommended practice and the metric itself. I want to first cover I've mentioned tier 3s and tier 4s. We're going to start with the most severe. The most severe being lagging indicators. And I'll have the classification and then what exactly is being measured. Let's see. So within our lagging indicators, we have tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s, tier 4s, and the most severe being tier 1, the least severe being tier 4. Tier 1, loss of primary containment. This is a for injury. It's a lost time recordable injury, or it's a community impact, or it's a fire or explosion with greater than 100,000 US dollars in cost, or it's a loss of primary containment grand tier 1 threshold quantity release in 1 hour. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what that tier 1 threshold release quantity actually means. And there's a time limit on it. So the release has to be over an hour or more. And it has to be a certain quantity for different types of chemicals. For a tier 2, it's a little bit less severe. So instead of a lost time recordable for the injury, it's a recordable injury. For the explosion cost, the economic cost, it's between 2,500 and 100 US dollars. And then for the threshold quantity release, there's different parameters for that as well. And I'll show you what exactly that looks like for the difference between a tier 1 and a tier 2. For tier 3s and tier 4s, these are more challenges to safety systems. So pressure relief device activations, and then tier 4s, less severe than that. So management system failures, this can be near misses. So that's why I drawed out that portion to a process safety event, also including near misses. I think it's also important to understand the American Chemistry Council does not collect tier 3s and tier 4s. While we encourage our members to do such, a lot of those parameters can be site specific. And so what we do is we really focus on the lagging indicators, the tier 1s and the tier 2s, and that informs most of our process safety programs. So this table here, just it gives you a different visualization of what I just showed you, because I know that was a lot for that last slide. Here we have the consequence broken down on the left side, and then what that is for tier 1s and tier 2s. You can see for a tier 1, the consequence for an injury is much more severe. And a lot of these definitions might be borrowed from the United States Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So a recordable injury is a definition borrowed from our OSHA. Same with days away, injury, fatality, hospitalization. Most of those are self-explanatory, I think, but they have specific definitions within our regulations. For community impact, this is only triggered for tier 1s, and that's any shelter in place, a declaration of a community evacuation. The event will automatically be a tier 1 event. Property damage, we have our different threshold dollar amounts for tier 1s and tier 2s. And then for acute spills, this is measured off the time of 1 hour. Again, so, and it'll depend based off of the type of material released, how hazardous the material is, which will dictate whether it's a tier 1, tier 2, or whether it's not a tier 1 or tier 2. So I want to start out first with the threshold quantity release. We call it the TRQ. This is probably, well, it is the most common type of process safety event we have. If it's a tier 1 or tier 2, the probability of it just being a tier 1 or tier 2 because of threshold quantity release is relatively high. Most events aren't causing a community to evacuate. Most events aren't causing environmental damage. Most events aren't even hurting people. It's just a release of material. It's still very important that we understand all aspects of the event that's happening so that we can make improvements. So, as I've mentioned before, every material has a different threshold quantity relative to the chemicals hazards, and they're listed from most hazardous to least hazardous. When we classify the incidents based off of the hazardous material, we have 2 different options in recommended practice. Option is United Nations Dangerous Goods language, UNDG. This is predominant within the United States. In the second option, we have the globally harmonized system, GHS. This is pretty much everywhere else in the world. So you guys use GHS, whereas we're the oddballs. I don't know why. Well, use UNDG. So I'm less of an expert on GHS. I understand UNDG a little bit better, but for intents and purposes of this presentation, they're very similar in how it works from the most severe to the least severe, or the most hazardous, I should say, to the least hazardous. So TRC stands for threshold release category. We have threshold release category 1, 2, 3, 4. I've bucketed it here to 1 through 4. Toxic inhalation hazards. I'll show you some examples of what exactly that might be in a slide coming up. TRC 5, you see a lot more flammable gases. And these footnotes really just explain it excludes strong acids. I'll explain why we're excluding strong acids and bases in a little bit. TRC 6 is mostly flammable liquids. TRC 7 is some combustible liquids, but some other packing group 3 liquids. That's kind of, there's exceptions to every one of these, but for all intents and purposes, this is the general kind of flow of the hazards. And then our last least severe group, threshold release category 8, some combustible liquids and strong acids and bases. So we've talked about threshold release quantities. There is another form of releases, and that is through engineering pressured relief devices, upset emissions from permitted sources. Now, permitted sources, that's really tied into our regulations, but you can understand the concept there. So for the consequences, if it's going to be a loss of primary containment from an engineered pressure relief, it's got to be a release from the engineering pressured relief device, like a pressure relief device, or an upset emission from a permitted source greater than the tier 1 or tier 2 threshold release quantity within 1 hour. And it has to result in rain out, discharge to a potentially unsafe location. Unsafe location, what is the definition of that? There's some subjectivity there. The third one is an on-site shelter in place or on-site evacuation. And then lastly, public protective measures like road closures, all of those have to be consequences of it being of a loss of primary containment through an engineered pressure relief device. There's some exclusions though. If your company deems it's a safe release, so kind of going back to some of those definitions, what is a safe release? Well, your company's probably going to define it. Your company's attorneys will define what is a safe release. Certainly, it has to be planned. So any release that doesn't have any consequences listed above, if you can see my cursor, that would maybe be a candidate for an exclusion. Engineering pressure relief or a permitted source operating as designed, or if it's operating as intended, that's another one. So I think I jumped a couple bullets, having trouble seeing them from my. Oh, well, so focusing still on threshold quantity release, I want to get into the weeds, and there's a couple kind of caveats here that are worth bringing to your attention. And I will say that this presentation really is high level. If you've read the recommended practice, it really gets into a lot more weeds than what we're covering today. But I wanted to bring up a couple points that I think is important as we understand threshold release quantity. When we collect the information on the material, we do it from the safety data sheet typically. So, and within in hazard priority order, the most hazardous from the least hazardous is always how we collect that information. I know this is UNDG is mostly United States focused, but you saw the word packing group on there. UNDG packing group usually can be found in the transportation section of the safety data sheet. The relative flammability determined by boiling point or flash point. To make and what dictates a strong acid having and then there's the relationship between the threshold quantity of tier 1s, tier 2s, and then indoor and outdoor. So we haven't really visited indoor and outdoor threshold quantities yet. But what it's very important to really understand the difference. As you can imagine, a release indoors can be far more dangerous than a release outdoors. And so there is a rhyme and a reason on why we've created the practice this way. Everything's based off of tier 1 outdoor threshold quantity release. So a tier 1 outdoor is a tier 1 outdoor. A tier 1 indoor is 10% of a tier 1. And then we're moving down to a tier 2. A tier 2 outdoor is 10% of a tier 1. And then a tier 2 indoor is 50% of a tier 2. So that shows you the relationship between how threshold quantities were developed. And this is the table that we use to determine the threshold quantity. There's a lot going on here, so please don't try to digest it all. I'll show you just some of the basics to this table. Here to the left, the left-hand column, we have the categories. That's the threshold release categories that I was talking about. And then the next two columns over, we have our option 1, UNDG, which is what the United States is probably going to be using. And then the third column is GHS. And that's what most of the rest of the world will be using. And then we have our quantities for tier 1 and tier 2, indoor and outdoor. You can see. So for example, threshold release category 1, the quantities are very small, greater than 5 kilograms, whereas that drastically increases whenever we move down here to threshold release category 5. You have 500 kilograms. Examples of what this is. Examples of what this is: threshold release category 1, you're going to see phosgene, you're going to see bromine. For threshold release category 4, you're going to see ammonia. And you can, that kind of goes down to more or less hazard chemicals as we into threshold category 8. I'm not going to show you that table. It's in the recommended practice. And much more digestible, not in a presentation. So I wanted to talk about some of the changes that were recently made to this recommended practice. Anna has indicated that some companies within Latin America might still be using the second edition of API-RP 74. API has updated and created a third edition, and there was a few relevant changes that kind of affect how you classify your process safety event. And I'll just touch on a few of them, some of the ones I think are more relevant. So corrosives are now classified differently. Strong acids and bases were moved from a threshold release category 7 to a category 8. And then moderate acids and bases were moved off of the threshold release category 8 table altogether. So what does this mean? How's it going to impact you? If you had an incident with a moderate acid and it was just through threshold quantity, it's probably not going to be a tier 1 or a tier 2. Whereas a strong acid prior could have been classified as a tier 1. Now it might be classified as a tier 2. These are general terms, it really depends on the specificity of the incident. That's a very important move because now your process safety event count might look different than what it did under the second edition. Another major change, and this is one I really like because it changes the data that it gives more granularity to the data that we collect. So I can go in, I can truly understand a little bit better what was happening during that incident. And so they have limited the number of causal factors that you can select within identifying your process. And then within those primary causal factors, you can now select sub-causal factors. And so you can get an extra level of granularity. For example, the causal factor, let's say you have an event and the causal factor was communication, poor communication. Well, that doesn't tell me much, right? What type of communication? Was it miscommunication during shift turnover? Was it there was no communication? Was it some of the information was communicated, but not all? So it gets into a level of granularity that you can start to understand what was happening when the event occurred, or some of the factors that may have led up to the incident. Another major change to the recommended practice was on the hazard classification system for tier 1 and tier 2. It used to be under the second edition that API wanted you to use UNDG, that reporting option number 1. Well, since the third edition, they have now allowed us to pick between UNDG and GHS. And this allows our global community to better adapt using systems that they're much more familiar with. So before I get into some of the examples of process safety events or events that may not be process safety, I'll pause there for questions. Okay.
Safety is also considered impact to environment. Why don't we have material percentages to environment in DRC? Could you read the question?
The question is, in process safety also considered impact to environment. Why don't we have material hazardous to environment within the TRC, or the threshold release category? Well, going back to our triggering factors for process safety events, tier 1, let's take tier 1, for example. We have those 5 triggering factors. Threshold release category is 1. Environmental impact is a separate one. So you could have an event that has an environmental impact, but doesn't meet the threshold quantity release, and it would still be classified as a tier 1 incident. So that they're separate triggering factors, but more often than not, what you would see is it would meet both criteria. It would meet the threshold quantity release, and it would also have environmental impact. And so there's just different triggering criterias that that allow us to make sure we collect all of the incidents that we need.
La siguiente pregunta es, ¿un evento de seguridad de procesos puede también estar relacionado con la liberación súbita de energías peligrosas? Por ejemplo, un arco eléctrico o una descarga de alta tensión. ejemplos estos para el sector eléctrico?
That's a really good question. So can a security related incident lead to a process safety event? And in general, yes, it can. If you have bad actors coming on site and it causes the release of material that meet all the criteria, it would ultimately be a process safety event and a security event. That's an interesting question. I haven't had that one yet. All right. So classifying incidents, I have some examples here from the recommended practice that we can go through, and I want to challenge those in the room to give me the answer. So I might call on you if no one's talking. So let me set this up for you. Over here to the left, we have some of those questions that you would see in a flow diagram to classify an incident. So first of all, was it unplanned? Was it uncontrolled? That's important. It has to be unplanned or uncontrolled. Was it a release from a process? It has to be from a process. Did it result in an injury? Okay, maybe it didn't have an injury associated with it, but did it have a fire or explosion with economic damage? Maybe, maybe not. Did it have a community impact? Was it an unsafe release from a pressure relief device? Or was it an acute spill above the threshold release quantity in any 60-minute period? Again, that's the hour mark that we're looking for any release of material. So I'll keep that left-hand process questions there for you to see as we go through these questions. So an operator walking through a process unit and slips and falls to the ground, suffering a days away from work injury. The slip fall is due to weather conditions. Can anyone guess if this is a process safety event or a tier 1 or tier 2?
No, yo lo pienso más, no es un incidente de seguridad de procesos, es más, tiene que ver con salud y seguridad, que algo relacionado con seguridad de procesos, porque pues algo que le pasa a un operador, pero digamos no tiene que ver con un release, una pérdida de contención, sino simplemente es debido a algo que está de pronto en el suelo, que no tendría significativamente que ver con el proceso.
That's exactly right. There was no release of any material whatsoever. So this is not a process safety event. It's not even associated with the loss of primary containment. So next scenario, a scaffold builder experiences a days away from work injury after falling from a scaffold ladder while evacuating from a loss of primary containment on nearby equipment. So here, can you guess whether or not it is a process safety event? And if so, is it a tier 1 or tier 2?
No, I answered that it is a process safety event because the injury happened because he was evacuating from a LOP event.
I just in the room that we're in right now, they all have the questions on the board. The questions, the answers, yeah. But you're right. It was a tier 1 process safety event because it was injury that occurred as a consequence resulting in the loss of primary containment. So the scaffold builder was evacuating because of the LOPC. And while it wasn't an exposure, it was still a consequence of the LOPC.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so let's see the next one. Oh, car storage was observed to be leaking. The investigation found that about 1,500 gallons of weak hydrochloric acid was released throughout the day. Throughout the day, we can assume a 24-hour period. Can anyone take a guess at what this might be? This one, you can't see the answer on the board. So we have weak hydrochloric acid as a threshold release that we are considering for the LOPC. Was it part of the process? Well, we go back to our definitions and understanding that storage was included, and there's some specificity to what type of storage it has to be in order for it to be considered part of the process. But for the intent of this example, it is part of the process. So then the question becomes, was 1,500 gallons included within our table that indicates whether it was a threshold release quantity triggering event? And if you remember from the third edition changes, weak acids are no longer considered on our threshold release categories. And so this is not a tier 1 or tier 2 event.
It's a strong acid. Is this a strong acid?
So
Kind of.
yes. And within this example,
We are assuming that.
yeah, sure. But it gives like a level of specificity within what they tested on site. And it was innocuous, watered down hydrochloric acid.
Okay, so kind of diluted.
Right, it depends on the concentration. So for this example that was given in recommended practice, they gave more specificity, but the example is probably wrong.
Okay, understand.
So we're speaking in more general terms. That's it. So those are just a few of the examples of how to classify events. There are a lot of caveats. It can really get into the weeds. Even for a lot of our more experienced process safety engineers, one of the ways that we help educate even the most experienced process safety engineers is through some of our programs. And I'll talk a little bit about one that I really enjoy because I get to learn from these folks. But there's a lot of peer-to-peer knowledge sharing that's ingrained in these programs. We try to foster relationships to get people to build a relationship and trust each other. That way they can help drive improvement together. So one of the first things that we have that I want to share with you is our process safety code. This was developed in 2020. And like many of our programs, we developed it in response to high profile incidents. Some of those incidents that we keep talking about, it's really why this matters so much, keeping our community safe, our employees safe. And what we did with this process safety code is we took lessons learned from OSHA PSM, which is one of our regulations. And we took those lessons. We also were applying those lessons to non-process safety management covered facilities. So OSHA PSM covers a certain type of facility. We've gone beyond that and we're applying some of the lessons to non-covered facilities. And you can see from the sheet of paper on this slide, we start out with leadership, culture, and accountability, and we make our way down comprehensive process safety management systems, information sharing. This takes a plan, do, check, act process, starting with planning being, establishing leadership and culture and accountability within your organization, gaining the knowledge and the expertise, and then going down to acting, plan, do, check, act, monitoring and improving. So I think some of what we measure might be obvious. Process safety event tier 1 count. How many tier 1s did you have? How many tier 2s did you have? This metric is so robust and there's so much more involved. If you've had the opportunity to talk to Anna and her team, they've been collecting some of these metrics and there's so much granularity to it. So I wanted to show you kind of just a high level demonstration of what it looks like, what we try to do. Of course, we have our process safety event count. We do tier 1s, tier 2s, how many we're doing year over year. This is important to us to see in general from broad strokes, how is our performance doing? We collect a process safety event rate. So tier 1 rate, a tier 2 rate. This is a function of how many hours your company worked. And you can calculate a rate based off of what your facility is doing. We do it by company. It just makes it easier for us. The formula is, if we're doing tier 1 process safety event rate, it's how your total count tier 1s multiplied by 200,000 divided by the amount of hours that you worked. And that gives us the rate. Why 200,000 in the United States? We use 200,000 to inform our rates because it's the approximate number that 100 employees, it's the approximate hours that 100 employees would be working in one whole year. And that's based off of the United States. We have a 40-hour work week. So now getting into a little bit more granularity where we can really identify, sifting through the weeds, what's important. We have potential causal factors. Right now, and what we commonly see year over year, our causal factors are equipment reliability, design and construction, or procedures. So we will launch certain initiatives or programs based off of this information. So do we need to have a more robust procedure writing program that we can offer to our members? So we'll develop programs based off of this data. And then we have our sub-causal factors. This is the one I told you I was excited about, really kind of gets in there. Every single one of these potential causal factors that you can see on the screen has different factors, and they all have to be relevant to the primary causal factors. We collect mode of operation. What mode of operation was the plant operating under when the event happened? Was it normal mode? Were you starting up the plant? Was it routine maintenance? Were you in turnaround? We have point of release information. So where did the release happen? Was it small bore piping? Was it from an atmospheric tank? Did the release happen from a pump? It just gets more granular. And then the type of material. So this goes back to threshold quantity release. So was it a flammable? Was it a toxic? Was it a corrosive? We're able to collect a lot of that data. And with that, and I may talk about this in a little bit, but we're not just, I show you some of these example graphs here. We'll give this data to our members in this kind of simplistic aggregated form, but we're also able to identify correlations between, okay, well, what type of material is more likely to be released during which mode of operation? And then you start seeing an additional layer of value from doing the in-depth analysis, and then better inform our programs, better inform our members of how we can drive improvement. So here's here I'm going to show you a couple examples of where we are. This is all public information. We've provided this information in a public fashion, so you can find it on our publicly facing website. The additional layer of granularity that I was talking about, we keep that to our members. They have full access to it, so we provide spreadsheets to where they can manipulate the data. But we also provide reports in which, you know, they can have a more granular approach. They can share it with their executives. They can share it with their teammates. But here we have our tier 1 process safety event counts. And to explain this graph, I know we like pretty graphs, but we didn't color this just to be pretty. It has meaning. So the gray part here is back when the American Chemistry Council was using different definitions for what a process safety event was. In 2017, as part of our Enhancing Process Safety program, we adopted API's recommended practice. And when we adopted this, the definitions changed a little bit. And so we distinguish that change with the color blue. And then from 2021 to 2022, 2020 to 2021, we have a shift to the 3rd edition. So, but what's important to us here is, while it might be difficult to see without a trend line, this is decreasing. And so our last year's data that was collected, you can see it's 189 tier 1 incidents. Now, that number is really irrelevant on the global scale. It's all representative of who we represent. And so the raw number doesn't mean anything when benchmarking globally. But in order for the American Chemistry Council to keep track of where we're going, we have to understand where we came from. And you see there is a decrease. And that's something that we're very proud of. We've had some programs in place that are just starting to get to a more mature level. And I think we're starting to see the fruits of our labors and the dedication of our members. This is the one process safety event rate. You can kind of see where we came from, 2021. Now, going back to the raw counts, you can see why we have a drastic drop off. But for all, you know, for those of you data scientists out there, I will say that the hours worked between 2021 and 2022 are relatively plateaued. So we're not seeing huge swings in hours that's going to this rate. This rate is only affected because of our improved safety performance, our process safety performance. Here we have a map of our tier 1 process safety events by state. This is just a demonstration of how we're able to cut the data. So if we have an initiative that focuses on each individual state, and we'll go to that state and we'll talk to them about process safety. We'll talk about some of the other things that that ACC is working on. And so we like to be able to cut the data individually. And this is something that Anna has the ability to do as well, is cut it by the different areas within Columbia. Now, this, for those data scientists, you're probably saying, well, what's the normalization factor, right? Well, how many sites are in each state? You know, Texas has the most tier 1 process safety events, but they also have the most sites. So we do some normalization factors, but I just wanted to demonstrate the capabilities of what we have. Again, type of material, so you can kind of see a breakdown. I stripped away the numbers. This is something that it really, for the intent of this demonstration, what order they're in isn't necessarily what's important, but the fact that we're able to cut the data this way, and I can say what type of material is happening indoor versus outdoor. And if most of your operations are indoor, you might want to focus on something different than those outdoor folks. So all of that's very important, and us being able to identify correlations between the different metrics has really been impactful.
However, also for the type of the industry that isn't located in Texas, that maybe also is greater than number of events.
Yeah, so we don't necessarily break down by type of industry. We just use the collective. This is the chemical manufacturing industry. Now we use a certain government classification code for who we represent. And it includes plastic manufacturers and chemical manufacturers. And those are the two areas that we focus on, but we won't differentiate like pharmaceutical versus chemical versus specialty chemical necessarily. Next program, we call it the Progressive Achievement Program. And this is probably one of our most impactful programs. And this stemmed from a strategic review that our board of directors had, in which they produced 10 recommendations to the staff, to the association, on how we might be able to improve. The first one of the recommendations was establish a process safety goal to reduce incidents. The second was establish a program so you can reach the goal. This program was born. So what this is, it gives valuable resources in many cases, resources. Our membership, some of our membership select is completely voluntary. However, we typically have 98% or approximately 90% members that we offer it to, they take it. So it's really a 3-year program. During the first year, we offer all kinds of stuff like CCPS workshops, the Center for Chemical Process Safety. And they do a fantastic job of going to our members' executive leadership, vice presidents, CEOs, and making sure that they understand process safety and what that means, communicating it. So this is a personal coaching geared towards executives to make sure that their priority is process safety. We offer all kinds of workshops. Another one of our extremely valuable ones is the SOCMA online training for the operators. We've got plenty of other resources, webinars. So that's for the first year. The second year, we get into some special advisors. So as a data analyst, I'll go in and look at the company's incidents if they qualify for the program and try to understand need help. Is it with procedure writing? Is it with mechanical integrity? And then we'll have special advisors, go and do site visits, give them the tools that they might need in order to improve. We have select webinars for this as well. And then I mentioned it's a third-year program. For anyone that's still participating in the program, the third year, they can kind of recycle some of these resources that are available to them. So this is probably my favorite program. I know I probably said that about all of but so we have what's called a process safety regional network program. And you can see each one of the states is outlined in a different color, meaning they're bundled together. So for example, Texas is one of our more densely populated areas as far as industry goes. So Texas is all alone by itself. But what this program offers is for process safety engineers, process safety managers, and their staff to come together in the same room and talk about challenges, talk about lessons learned. And so it's very, very much like we are in this room, to where they'll have a fixed agenda. Maybe they're talking about open-ended lines or open bleeders. Well, do you have any programs? I've got this program, but I'm having trouble with this specific issue. Do you have any advice for me? And it's an open dialogue, peer-to-peer, that really drives change. And what we found is so often a company might have what's called a golden nugget, that key piece of information, and they don't think it's that great. They don't realize it as being that fantastic because they've been doing it for 10 years. But the other company could really benefit from that key piece of knowledge. So creating the dialogue between the different sites and the different companies has immensely helped our process safety programs. And again, we go back to, when done responsibly, safety is not proprietary. And so we're all here to improve together.
Why not in the Western region?
So we've explored going into the West a little bit, but it really comes down to the density of our membership and where most of our sites are. I think that there has been, we've begun an analysis on whether or not we'd get the bang for our buck, basically. But fair question. And for now, what we've offered is those that are in the Western states, they're more than welcome to join any of the regions. So before I close up, this is just a small taste, a small menu of what we have. We have our process safety committee. And while they might deal with a lot of the regulations that come across our table, they also do a lot of the data analysis. So they have work groups. They have a work group for the metrics specifically. They also, within that metrics work group, one of their objectives is to assist process safety engineers on how to classify incidents. Like I said, the practice can be very in the weeds. It can be complicated, especially when you get into certain caveats around releases. And for the most part, these engineers, they want to classify their incidents properly with consistency and quality. And so what better way to call up their fellow engineer through us and ask questions and come to an understanding together. So our programs go way beyond this. This is, again, just a taste, and we're continuing to drive process safety performance through our programs like this. Something we're very proud of, we're very excited about, especially whenever it's metric collection season and you get to see the good performance that comes through the door. So with that, I will, before I thank everyone for your time today, I'll stop now and see if there's any questions.
Muchas gracias por los contenidos que nos compartiste, muy interesante. Tengo una hipótesis personal, y es que cuando se presenta uno de estos eventos hay una muy alta probabilidad de que se presente un incendio. No sé si dentro de las estadísticas que ustedes tienen, de ese promedio que es algo así un poquito superior a 200 incidentes por año, ¿conoces cuántos de esos incidentes reportados terminaron en incendio? Y si tienen valores de pérdidas y este tipo de situaciones derivadas de la emergencia.
Gracias. So I don't know the answer to your question offhand, but we have the ability to do that analysis very quickly. So with the level of data that we collect, I could easily calculate how many of the incidents are causing fires and how many of the incidents are causing fires that result in economic loss or significant economic loss. And that's the beauty of this recommended practice, is it gets into some of the level of granularity. Now, when we start looking at that level of granularity, it's also important to understand that within our membership's very diverse. So not everyone is having releases with flammables. Not everyone has flammables at their facility. So that's another thing that we try to take into account and try to understand to the best of our abilities when we do an analysis like that.
¿Tienen alguna estadística o manera de medir accidentes si son provocados por algún fenómeno natural, natural o antrópico no intencional? Y si con qué incidencia algunos de estos fenómenos son recurrentes a generar incidentes en la industria.
So natural disasters typically happen so infrequently that it's relatively easy to determine whether or not that exact cause was a natural disaster. One good thing about our metric collection is we have an event description that they can write what happened in the incident. And more often than not, the person reporting the incident is going to say, this happened from a hurricane. Now, if they don't, we can, with relative ease, determine if the natural disaster caused the incident, because we know when the natural disaster happened. So for example, on the Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana, we're very prone to hurricanes. Where I grew up, in 2005, we had a major incident, or a major hurricane come, and it's very densely packed with industry. And I believe there may have been an incident caused by that hurricane. Well, again, in 2015, or 2019, I believe, we had another major hurricane, and it did result in a release. Now, when we collect that information, the reporter is probably going to put happened during Hurricane Laura, and then explain what exactly happened.
y esos eventos recurrentes, en este caso por huracanes, ha permitido generar estrategias de reducción o mitigación para que los impactos o la liberación de esos niveles sea menor o no sea, aumente, no sé, derrames, incendios en el misma empresa o en el mismo sitio donde son recurrentes esos fenómenos.
Yes, excellent question. So with all of our incidents, we try to understand what happened so that we can develop plans to prevent it. But specifically with disasters, hurricanes, even lightning strikes, we've had serious incidents happen from a lightning strike to where now you'll see the development of hurricane preparedness plans. You know, if a hurricane is predicted to come to your city, what do you need to do to safely shut down in an orderly manner? What does safe shutdown mean? Which that's going to change from site to site. And then also afterwards, how do you assess the situation to see if your facility is safe to start up again? And so that's very site specific. So we don't necessarily, ACC doesn't necessarily get involved with that, but we help encourage it. We help facilitate sites to do their own hurricane preparedness program or lightning strike program or tornado preparedness program. And of course, earthquakes on the West Coast. So all of those are taken into account. And while we don't necessarily write procedures ourselves, we encourage companies and sites to do them to the best of their needs.
También mencionaba que son aproximadamente como más de 70 países. Hay planes mutuos de ayuda entre las empresas asociadas o las empresas con las que ustedes tienen inscritas o de acuerdo a las capacidades que tiene cada una de ellas para atender cada uno de esos incidentes.
Relative to all the different countries, and are there any plans for collaboration? So I'm going to pass the microphone to my colleague Sherry, who runs our global strategies, and she's really the reason why we're here. Thank you, Sherry. But specific to natural disaster procedures and programs, we don't have anything outside the United States that I'm aware of. But maybe Sherry can shed some light more on how we interact globally and how our responsible care colleagues communicate.
Okay. So as Danny said, through the International Council of Chemical Associations, we have the Responsible Care Leadership Group. So 64 chemical associations around the world that implement responsible care in their countries. And one of the things that we do is we try to share best practices and learnings. So for an example, after COVID, right, when COVID happened, a lot of plants had to shut down very quickly. And several of our experts got together and drafted a guidance document on how to restart your plant in a safe manner. Right. So we shared that document. We had it translated into 10 or 12 languages, shared it around the world, right, to try to prevent any type of incident once plants reopened after the end of the COVID restrictions. So we do things like that periodically. Oftentimes they're in response to an incident happening like COVID. We don't at this point have any type of planned activities around emergency response, but that's not to say that we couldn't in the future. We do have a lot of work going on around the world to try to share information and best practices on self-assessment, right? We're trying to help companies, particularly small to medium-sized companies, better assess where they are in terms of their responsible care implementation to identify gaps in their programs. We're also doing some joint activities around the world on safe warehousing. One of the things we've heard about from some associations, there have been incidents in warehouses, where, there was explosions, things weren't properly managed in the warehouse. So right now we have work going on, as we learned this morning here in Colombia on that topic. We've also undertaken a big project in India where there were several incidents in warehouse facilities, and also in China. And so in October, we're going to be having a meeting in India. And one of the topics we're going to be looking at is warehousing, and how do we collectively share best practices and the learnings that folks have done in different places around the world, so that we can make sure that all 64 of our associations are benefiting from what those 3 associations have been working on. So if that helps. Sure.
Question?
No, mientras estábamos viendo la presentación, me estaba preguntando, dado que la mano de obra en la industria de Estados Unidos está impactada por muchos inmigrantes, si hay evidencias de que ese mix entre gente americana e inmigrantes tenga un cierto impacto en la cultura en materia de riesgo o seguridad de procesos, dado que, por ejemplo, en países como en Japón, la mano de obra es mucho más local, entonces hay mucho más estándar, más procedimiento que puede ser, digamos, igualmente entendido por todos, pero al tener una mezcla impactada por inmigrantes, si hay alguna evidencia de que esas métricas en seguridad de procesos, digamos, están en mucho más riesgo al tener muchos mix.
Thank you. So from my perspective, and what I've seen, our baseline entry training programs are relatively robust. So just to step foot as an operator or a contractor into our lines, into the facility, they already have to have certain trainings. And in many cases, it goes beyond basic training. So we call it basic orientation plus is what a lot of our companies might require. And that goes through a training of these are the hazards, these are the expectations. This is the baseline knowledge that you need in order to even cross the fence. And then before you're even able to find a job, get the job, you have site-specific training. And so the levels of training that are required for each facility are such that that's probably not that strong of an issue for our members, just because they do the upfront training for you. As far as language barriers, I'm aware of several nonprofit training organizations that have trainings offered in other languages, specifically Spanish. And I heard a presentation recently on how they do it. So keywords like process safety, they don't necessarily translate those keywords into Spanish. And that way, when you're talking about process safety or line breaking or mechanical integrity on site, it's a universal understanding that this is what we're talking about. And so, but then the rest of the training will be in Spanish to build comprehension. So I would say that attributed to our robust training up front, it's probably not that big of a challenge.
To that experience that I learned about in India, right? The Indian Chemical Council, we did our first pilot project, Indian Chemical Council, 2 years, similar to what we're doing here with Columbia. They were first. One of the elements of their program was to improve their transportation safety, because they don't have a whole lot of regulations and safety requirements in India. And they were looking to hire more drivers, right? To train drivers to drive trucks with hazardous materials. Well, when they were planning the program, the individuals that they were looking to train, there were 27 different languages in India, right? And some of the candidates for this training were illiterate, right? They were not able to read. And so this was a real challenge. So what they did is they had to really localize the training, if you will, right, for different regions of the country. And in some cases, even develop pictograms, right, to help educate these workers on what it was, the product they're actually going to be transporting, what to do if there was an incident, right? If the truck rolls over and something starts spilling, what do you do? So we really had to sort of figure out how to train people in one country that were, different languages, different cultures, varying degrees of education. And what they did is they didn't just train them, they tested them, right? So the trainers had the trainees had to pass a test to qualify, right? And not everyone passed the test. So it had to be very rigorous.
So to continue to build off of that, though, I saw a statistic recently that in the Houston area where I live, about 35% of the residents there, their first language is Spanish. Right. And so I think our industry has really done well at adapting to make training accessible to get the quality employees to operate the facilities. So I haven't heard of too many challenges, and I hope it continues to improve regardless. So.
O digamos, una pregunta que dirigida por dos maneras. Una, digamos que nosotros viendo como grupo de industria química, cuando estábamos trazando la ruta de indicadores de desempeño y seguridad de proceso y veíamos Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4, en un comienzo estábamos siendo muy ambiciosos, que eso lo discutimos contigo, de incluir todos los 4 niveles. Pero entonces la recomendación fue empecemos de una manera progresiva. Uno pensaría que digamos que este tema que normativamente va mucho más tiempo en los Estados Unidos, ¿por qué se han centrado solamente en Tier 1 y en Tier 2? Esa sería una punta. Y la segunda, que como es claro, indicadores de desempeño va a ser parte de uno de los elementos del sistema de gestión de seguridad de procesos con base en la normativa colombiana, el decreto 1347 de 2021. ¿Qué recomendaciones podrían dársele a los reguladores para saber qué camino tomar en cuanto a esa estandarización de los indicadores de desempeño desde el punto de vista normativo?
Perdón, no va con ninguna intención.
So if I could only be a fly on the wall during API's writing committee that established this recommended practice. Of course, this was developed in 2010. There wasn't much in the way of data collection as robust prior. So just finding uniformity across the refining, the petrochemical, and the chemical industries, I think that was a challenge. And we focused on lagging indicators, Tier 1s and Tier 2s. In the way that the recommended practice is written, Tier 3s really get into a level of specificity per site. And so this might be less of a challenge for an industry like refining, where a lot of the process units are very. it becomes exponentially more difficult when you get into a diverse industry like chemical manufacturing, where you're completely different process units. So with going back to the intent of the recommended practice, what the authors were thinking was tier 3s, tier 4s, you're getting into challenges of safety systems, near misses. And that might look different depending on different industries. Now, as of recent, we've started to have conversations about what it would look like for us to establish a uniform metric for our membership. I think we're ways away, but that's not something that we're not thinking about. But it just kind of goes back to the original intent of the recommended practice and it being so site specific. And so if the regulators were wanting to benchmark or collect that information, it's not as powerful, it's not as meaningful as the tier 1s and tier 2s for the aggregate, I would say. Still powerful. I don't want to discourage any companies from attempting to go down that route. So, and I don't know what type of steps we're going to take when we start engaging in tier 3s. But I can imagine it'll be first, it'll be, total count, challenges, safety systems. And then whenever you get to tier 4s and you start looking at near misses, there's a little bit more ambiguity there too. And we've started to explore what that looks like in the occupational safety space. And it's a challenge finding uniform, it's a challenge establishing definitions that everyone can agree on. And that goes back to the specificity per site.
¿Qué advice a los regulators? ¿Qué consejo a los reguladores?
La segunda pregunta que era, ¿qué consejo podríamos darle a los reguladores que este tema apenas se va a desarrollar aquí en Colombia, digamos, para poder establecer esas métricas desde el punto de vista normativo?
Well, luckily, I don't work in our regulatory department, so it's difficult for me to provide appropriate advice. But I think from the days when I was in the regulatory space, I would say, work with industry and industry work with the regulators to understand each other and each other's needs. So what we find in the United States is we try to go above and beyond regulation. Actually, last week we had OSHA, we had EPA in our office to talk a little bit about their processes and our relationships. And that's one thing that OSHA said was we need the relationship. We need industry to help us understand how this regulation is going to impact the industry. Are we writing the right language or are we completely off base? That could really burden the industry because that's not the intent. The intent of the regulation is always to drive safety improvement. So, I guess that, I guess that's, if I could say anything, it's collaboration. And of course, I don't understand the regulatory process here in Colombia, but that's the advice from the United States. So that's what we do.
A ver, Diego o Talia, explicarle cómo es el
It is a really, really long process. But no, mi pregunta estaba relacionada, my question was relacionada with, was it difficult or easy to have an open dialogue with the industry to share the experiences regarding the events or the chemical accidents and how to promote this process?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat?
Okay. En Spanish, bueno, no, la pregunta fue si, digamos, qué tan difícil o qué tan fácil fue, digamos, tener un diálogo abierto con la industria para, pues para tener conocimiento de los eventos que se estaban presentando, para que ellos pudieran compartir las experiencias que estaban teniendo relacionadas con pues, eventos que se pudieran presentar. Y la segunda parte sería cómo promover esa, digamos, esa experiencia, ese compartir de conocimiento, tanto las buenas como las malas experiencias que se pueden estar presentando.
So in the United States, we have a few different levels of communication between our regulators. Anytime they want to create a new rule, they'll issue what we call a notice for proposed rulemaking. There's things before that, but to kind of shorten the explanation, we'll notify the public that they're going to create a new regulation. And then we have to allow the public between 30 to 90 days to provide comment. And the public, any member of the public, but especially our trade associations will make comment on that regulation. So that's one way of communication. Another way of communication is probably more direct. It's through several regulations that are in place to where we must report incidents to the government. So we have the National Response Center, and we have the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, the CSB. You've probably seen their videos on YouTube. They're fantastic. If we have an incident that meets a certain reporting criteria to organizations, we immediately have to the phone and report the incident. Same thing with OSHA. If fatality on site, you have a certain time period in which you have to call OSHA and report the incident so that their investigators can come down and investigate. So that's the most direct route of communication, is through already existing regulation. Now, we have very robust safety programs, so we try to go above and beyond that regulation. We don't want to just stop at telling the regulators what they have to know. So we try to take a proactive approach. And so we have people in our organization, within our regulatory department, with our federal affairs department, that will interact regularly with the regulators. Maybe that's just a annual meeting. Would you like to come to our office, or can we come to your office and have a chat? I would like to share with you our safety performance and our priorities. And I would like to understand your priorities for the year. And so they'll have open dialogue like that. And that helps build a relationship between the career folks at the organization and our organizations. So, and then from there, they can continue conversations and get into more levels of granularity.
Gracias. Continuando con esa idea, me parece muy importante la relación que hay también con las organizaciones de gestión del riesgo y los bomberos. Digamos, en ese sentido, ¿qué experiencia tienen que también aporte a la regulación? Porque, digamos, a veces uno siente una desconexión entre la regulación y ya cuando llega el bombero, en el sentido de que muchas veces hemos identificado que los bomberos no necesariamente conocen qué materiales hay, por consiguiente no saben cómo atacar el incendio, y además desconocen también qué sistemas de protección tienen, entonces tampoco los pueden utilizar en beneficio pues de la acción que se está tomando en el momento. Entonces, ¿cómo lograr esa interacción también con esa parte de gestión del riesgo? Gracias.
That's a great question. Let me take a step back from just the emergency responders. One thing that the American Chemistry Council has an emphasis on, or within our responsible care program, is engagement with communities. And I think I mentioned it in the presentation earlier. We care about our employees just as much as we care about our communities and our environment. So we have an emphasis on, we call it our community advisory panels, getting industry engaged with the community. Part of the community is the local firefighter departments that might respond to an emergency, and interacting with them. So they might be a well-trained firefighter department. Do they know what kind of hazards we have at our site if you're going to respond to it? So we encourage the facilitation with them and our companies first and foremost. So that that relationship is probably the first step. And then to communicate how the emergency responders are interacting with the regulators. I think the American Chemistry Council is more likely to take that approach than the emergency responders, only because that's what we do for the industry. But it's all relationship building and communicating and making sure that the community understands what we're doing. The firefighters understand the potential hazards and what we're producing so that they know what they're getting into if they come to with a site in events.
I would just add that in some parts of the world, and I'm thinking of Vietnam, our association hosted events where they have, sort of pretend incidents. They've firefighters, emergency responders, ambulances. They even have citizens from the community who are sort of, acting as if they were injured or in some type of emergency. So they sort of set up a fake emergency, and they have all the different players or all the different stakeholders within the community come together and sort of play out how that situation should be handled, just as a training exercise, as part of their community outreach. It's very successful.
So do you want to, we just.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you all, those that are still remaining on the call. I appreciate you going quite a bit over. And of course, you that joined us in the room today. It's been a pleasure. I'm so happy that I had the opportunity to come and speak to you. I specifically want to thank you, Anna, for putting this all together. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to all the participants online. Talk to you next time. Bye. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes. Vamos a no solamente compartir las memorias, sino también la información de Dani. Lo molestamos porque es la cabeza que regula este tema en Colombia, el Ministerio de Trabajo. Pero acá de dar por finalizado que fue lo primero que debíamos hacer al iniciar, pero pues como ya estábamos sobre el tiempo para arrancar, sí, cada uno de ustedes vamos a empezar con Hugo. Se siente que Dani y Chiri sepan quiénes estuvimos hoy aquí. Entonces, gracias, Hugo.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Hugo Torres, yo soy director ejecutivo de ANRACI. ANRACI es Asociación Nacional de Protección contra Incendios en Colombia. También pues aquí siempre ayudando con Responsabilidad Integral Colombia y con mucho gusto para ayudarles en lo que podamos.
No sé qué camiseta ponerme, pero bueno. Mi nombre es Marcelo Rivero Rojas, yo soy ingeniero químico, profesor muchos años de la Universidad Nacional. Aquí tengo varios exalumnos y digamos que hoy vengo como representante del Ministerio de Educación ante el Consejo Profesional de Ingeniería Química de Colombia, que vigila el ejercicio de la profesión en Colombia. Dani, muchas gracias.
Buenas tardes para todos. Mi nombre es Natalia Uzcate y trabajo en el Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible. Estoy encargada, digamos, de temas que tienen que ver con sustancias químicas y con seguimiento de los compromisos post-acceso ante la OCDE.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Juan David Orrego. Yo soy gerente de planta IHS en Huntsman. Es una multinacional química localizada en Cartagena.
Muy buenas tardes, mi nombre es Diego Castellanos, trabajo con la Dirección de Riesgos Laborales del Ministerio del Trabajo. Estoy encargado de varios temas normativos, dentro de ellos coordino, porque yo lo acepto, yo de química sé muy poquito, coordino, así, he sido coordinador del tema de COMPES 3868. Entonces, aquí la que me ha enseñado a mí mucho son aquí en RI y Natalia, que es la que me regaña a diario.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Janet García del Ministerio del Trabajo de la Dirección de Inspección, Vigilancia, Control y Gestión Territorial. Entonces, después de lo que nos cuentan, creo que tenemos un gran reto y pues creo que es una fortuna poder conocerlos a ustedes y tener pues toda esta experiencia de aprendizaje que ustedes tienen. Entonces, seguramente desde la Dirección de Inspección estaremos preguntándoles y invitándolos a mesas de trabajo para poder establecer esta regulación tal como está en la agenda regulatoria del país. Gracias.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Jesús Durán, en representación de la Unidad Nacional para la Gestión de Riesgo de Desastres, de la Subdirección para el Conocimiento del Riesgo, del Grupo de Riesgo Tecnológico INAT. Es muy interesante el tema, más como lo dijo Ana María, todo el tema de la implementación del 1347 y todas las demás normativas que existen, pero no estamos aplicando, haciendo un seguimiento correctivo a toda esta normativa que tiene el país.
Buenas tardes a todos, mi nombre es Rafael Castillo. Soy el gerente de planta de Clariant Colombia, empresa que principalmente comercializa y distribuye químicos para diferentes sectores de la industria, y en Colombia específicamente fabricamos productos para tratamiento de crudo y tratamiento de agua.
Buenas tardes a todos, mi nombre es William Malaver, soy asistente técnico de producción en Clariant. De valiosa información acá todo lo que he recibido, porque mi vida laboral en el químico desde el 94 fui operador químico y pues he pasado por todos los cargos y me doy cuenta que hemos pasado mucho tiempo sin obtener esta información valiosa, y que es el momento de poder recopilar toda esta información, en vez de volvernos empresas distintas, competencias, que seamos pares. Entonces me parece que es muy importante esto que hemos recibido hoy. Gracias.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Marcela Rodríguez, soy funcionaria del Ministerio de Trabajo. Pertenezco al Grupo Interno de Riesgos Laborales de la Dirección de Inspección, Vigilancia y Control.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sherry Weibel. I'm the Senior Director for Strategy and Global Affairs in the Responsible Care Department at the American Chemistry Council. Much of my work is done under the International Council of Chemical Associations, to which Responsible Care Colombia, ACC were members. I work on something called the Responsible Care Leadership Group, where we work to strengthen and grow responsible care around the world. We currently have 64 responsible care associations, and we work to develop their capacity to make sure that they are safely managing chemicals in their economy.
So I think I introduced myself already. But I want to thank you again. So I started developing this presentation, Otter's industry advisory panel. My bachelor's and master's from the University of Louisiana, and recently I was invited to be on the industry advisory board. And when we started really engaging, I was a little bit more vocal than some. And so, I got told to be on special committees and stuff. And so I was voicing my opinion about process safety within the curriculum. Luckily so, because now they want me to be a guest speaker throughout the fall. So I started developing the presentation. And when Anna came and said, hey, this is what we're looking for, I said, perfect. So thank you for enduring my technical presentation on process safety.
No sé si Sandra Santiago y Ana María, les damos las gracias por habernos acompañado y al equipo de traductores también, que mañana los tratamos mejor. Gracias. Bueno, entonces muchas gracias a todos.